You're live. Orientation is locked. Rotate device back. Okay.
Yes. Watch this. This is a great stuff. Oh, they did that too. Yes. That's her. Yes, it is all of us. That's when I had just fallen, so I'm. And so the bird goes back to its owner. Yeah, and he's the owner.
Holly, awake your screen. Just push something. Go back to the overview slide. Okay.
We were just, I won't let that happen. But we were both going like, who's gonna bear sweet? No, they're real not. The French. So we really did take some. Although I'm not that well. I know. Listen, face planting at 7 is not. They're not supposed to fall after 7. This is my first thing. Okay, so then you have to do this. You have to do this. Okay.
Hi.
You have to go like
Good
this.
to see you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this at the 11.
Sure. Who did I
You have to do that for at least
pitch
30
it for?
seconds on each side.
Oh,
Every time.
got it. Okay.
Hi, it's so nice to see you. I enjoy reading. Oh, thank you so
Huh?
much. Thank you.
What?
I was gone. No, I mean, there's like, it's a lot. It's like, are you kidding me?
Wow, yeah, it was a
You
long
know
show.
what?
I saw them all.
I was like,
We survived.
how dare them?
Sorry, there's too many things going on at the same time.
Oh, I don't think I've seen that.
Okay, I can't weigh in. How you doing?
Oh, managed to do this to myself.
Oh my God.
Right after I passed the keys buried, I just never had this. Anyways, I'm the false love. So I don't know. Information, chances, how it changes.
Our kiddos did they did a job. They did their job. Are we all here? Oh, no.
Not here for business.
Have you read Braiding Sweetgrass?
I've heard of it, I have not read it. Do I
Well,
need to read it?
Yeah, I mean, after this, I was,
Yeah.
it confirmed with me that needs to be on your plate now when this is done.
I've heard of it, I've
Oh,
seen the, yeah.
It's powerful.
All right.
I'm the husband, Tom.
Yes, I know,
This
I
is my-
had her concert, you guys.
Yes,
saw.
oh yes, yes, we sang together at the
Oh, yeah.
her recital.
Oh, Lordy. I like the slide. Is that
Aren't
the
they
new slides?
nice?
Are those new slides?
They were out there, I searched Shenandoah slides.
Oh, I like that.
Cool.
So nice.
It's Sans laptop. Made a few notes, that's all.
Spectacular. Are we ready to start?
Are we waiting on any more of your?
No, my parents were gonna come, but my father was not feeling well, and so they are not here. They didn't make the trip from Pennsylvania, but I think they're.
Is there a projected time frame for this right now?
Probably, I'd say this now.
Okay, I can't be here past 6:30.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Opera auditions are tonight.
Oh,
Wasn't
that's
supposed to,
exciting.
it wasn't supposed to be on the same
Of
day as
course.
this, but anyway.
Of course.
It always
they can make the second visits, should be no problem.
Fabulous, it's a plan.
Let me make sure
So
I'm
thank
on
you all,
mute.
obviously, for being here tonight, and thank you, Polly, for all of the work you've put into this. I'm gonna have Catherine help me run things a little bit, as the dissertation format is slightly different from how we do our lecture recital documents. But first, of course, we're going to turn things over to you. If you could begin with your presentation, kind of walk us through the document, your work on this, and then at that point, we will have a few preliminary questions before we ask the public to depart for our deliberation.
Great. Well, I'm really delighted to be here today. So excited to share my project with you, Singing Instructions in American Tunebooks. Dissertation defense, it's hard to believe that here we are, but here we are. I have found this research process to be demanding and enlightening and very rewarding, and I'm really excited about what I've accomplished and been able to do because of it. So just to talk through the format for my presentation, we'll talk about the origin and the rationale, an overview of how I put things together, some findings, implications, and just conclusion. So the origin of the project. This project began as a part of my desire to make sense of my own personal experiences as a singer, a voice student, a voice teacher, a choral director, and a sacred musician. And also to understand some of the things that I had witnessed in the world of American singing, voice pedagogy, and voice professionalism. I'll share just a little bit about my own background here. I, from a very young age, was singing classical music, choral music, sacred music. I grew up steeped in Protestant hymnody. My father is a United Methodist pastor, also a music director, an organist, and choir director. I have a love of folk music because my mom, in addition to being a classically trained singer, would sing and play guitar at home, and so it was a pretty happy growing up, but that was my experience, and that's sort of my positionality and things. That's what I knew. I'm learning more. It was a beautiful growing up, but as I continued to advance, there were things that didn't quite make sense, things that didn't add up in what I observed around me, and I learned the language of cognitive dissonance here at Shenandoah. It was a term that was used often, and so I'm just going to share two examples of my own cognitive dissonance along the way. First of all, as an undergrad, I went to a school that had a wonderful choral classical singing department and program. When I got there, I sang in a chapel choir that was directed by a black student and had other black choir members in it. And I got into that situation and I was stunned because the voice colors that they were using were so vastly different from what I knew and had experienced. They were learning things by rote, and I was stunned. Like, it was just overwhelming to me in a way that they were doing this. I had no idea about it, and yet most of those people were singing with me in the choral context, and so clearly knew what I knew, but knew more that I had never been exposed to. So that was a big moment of cognitive dissonance. Another sort of happened gradually as I was ready to start teaching after finishing a master's degree in choral conducting and voice performance. Started teaching and slowly but surely realized that a lot of the training that I had received was not adding up. It wasn't meeting the needs of the students that I was encountering. So I just had these big moments of cognitive dissonance along the way. I made the decision in 2017 to attend the CCM Institute here at Shenandoah. I heard Jeff Ramsey and Marcel Gauvin speak about the roots of Black American musics, and they provided sound recordings of things. And that resonated with me tremendously, and I understood it differently because I was able to hear it. And just going back in time really helped me understand things. And then I applied, got into the school, start my DMA. I have researched the 701 class with Dr. Ruth. He asks us, what do you think your research interests might be? And I blurted out something like colonial times and questions about the interaction of singing traditions. And I was like, I don't even know where that came from. But in retrospect, I think it was taking shape for a long time. So I'm most excited to be sharing this. That's sort of a setup for what is coming. Research, we know, is motivated by sort of identifying a problem, something to fix or address that becomes a focal point for our investigation. And I would define, it took me a long time to articulate this, but I would define the problem in this context that I'm trying to address, that the complex history of singing and vocalization in this nation and the history of singing instruction is largely unknown, but it continues to impact the present, often causing entanglements and challenges for the voice community. And I have a recent example of that to share. Pardon me. This came across my path in February of this year. The ACDA, I'm a member of that organization, so our choral colleagues were dealing with what they called a violation of sonic sovereignty. They had programmed a piece of Native American music in a reading session, and it was outside of the cultural context that it was supposed to be honored in. And so they got a very frustrated letter about the negative impact that had. Now, ACDA has a DEI committee, and they were trying to be inclusive and incorporate other, traditions in their things, but it was considered an offense and a violation of this sonic sovereignty. And they were surprised by that. They didn't see it coming, and it took them a long time to respond and know what to say, because they had to do so much background research to even understand what had been happening. So I read the letter that they wrote, which was lovely. They were taking accountability for what had happened. But just the fact that they didn't really see it coming really struck me. And I think that can happen sometimes when we're trying to navigate and then something pops up seemingly out of nowhere. So our past collectively, right, in this country, and a lot of times in singing we don't necessarily connect that piece of it, but there's a lot that's problematic about the past that cannot be changed. But the voice community, I believe, can be more aware and better prepared for what we may encounter. And so I think about this work not just as addressing a problem, because yes, there is a problem, but sort of as a possibility. We may never avoid all of the pitfalls that there are laid for us, but this project is not just about risk management, but also the possibilities that open up when we understand and claim our history. So I see tremendous possibility. The purpose, and this is a little bit long, so I'll read it slowly, because it's pretty complicated, but I looked at a lot, so it's pretty complicated, but I think I'm trying to simplify. My purpose is to map or begin mapping the complex roots of American voice pedagogy and professionalism contained within American Tunebooks, celebrating the advances and individual contributions while reckoning with historic entanglements with cultural, religious, political, and racial systems within an emerging nation of exceptional diversity, where some aesthetic ideals were codified as better and more desirable, while others were not, and that resulted in the suppression and delegitimization of many voices and many ways of using the voice. That's pretty strong purpose. And someone may think, why does that last part matter? Why do we need to dwell on what may be painful and uncomfortable for us? What is the value in learning about this voice suppression and delegitimization? And to that, I would answer that voice pedagogy people, we have a lot of power. We have a whole lot of power. And when we are working with an individual voice, that instrument is that person, it's linked with their identity, with their culture, with their self-expression, with autonomy, with self-confidence, with their empowerment, even with their democratic personality. So if we step into a position of influencing another who comes to us for guidance, for instruction, I believe we do have a responsibility to understand the magnitude of that and to be prepared for that moment by understanding that there are these lingering entanglements in our midst. I know voice teachers and professionals to be people who really do their due diligence. We take accountability, we try to do the work, and so I see already, thanks to Spider-Man here, that great power, we are taking great responsibility, and this work is an extension of that, that we can learn from the past, heal the past, and then with intention not create the same struggles of the past, so that we can be aware of the legacy that we are continuing and looking forward to establishing. So an overview of my project. I'll just talk a little bit about the structure. I was gifted this tune book in 2019, and I put it on a shelf and I didn't look at it again. But shortly after that, when I had started at Shenandoah and expressed my research interests, I kind of stumbled on more tune books by accident. I had grown up with John Wesley's directions for singing in the United Methodist Hymnal. I was familiar with those, and I just started to think, I wonder if anybody else made instructions for singing. So I started to look around. I went on IMSLP, Public Domain Library, and I found a listing of hymnals. And I thought, okay, I'll just check these hymnals and see. And I found tune books there because there were some of those listed as well. People don't always differentiate one from the other. But I found tune books there and just more singing instructions that I could be, it was staggering how much I found. So I went into a very deep dive, a rabbit hole as it were, and just found hundreds of examples in this primary source material, and I knew that I wanted to focus on that. But I also understood that the weight and the intent and the meaning of their instructions at face value doesn't mean as much. You can't understand what it was dealing with if you don't understand where the historic context. So it was my intention to tell a more complete story by including that. So that required a two-pronged strategy or approach, and so the first part of that was to do a sonic evaluation, which became really the body of the work. And my idea with this was to resound the colorful and diverse singing and vocalization practices and the sonic negotiations of our nation's history. I especially decided to focus on the time period before American tune books so we could understand what was happening there, and wanted to sort of make it clear that there were power struggles around sound happening. So I wanted to start before tune books, and then I extended the sonic evaluation through sort of the decline of that genre of book, because it stopped printing them around the end of the 19th century. Did I say that right? I think I did. Sometimes I get the dates. All right. And then the second part was to do the bibliographic study. I had already started to catalog a lot of what I was finding, and that this was a way of me sort of tracking and mapping the roots of what I was finding about pedagogy and professionalism in the tune books. So I'll speak a little bit first about the sonic evaluation. I found the book How Early America Sounded very early on in this process by Richard Cullen Rath. And he wrote about the idea that sound mattered to Americans in ways that it no longer does to us, that we can't quite understand. But just to sort of summarize his ideas, he talks about how interpreting sound was connected to safety. It marked physical and psychological territory. It was relied upon for communication. It was a marker of identity and a way of establishing community. Before there was electricity, in the pitch black dark of night, it was really linked with survival, right? Interpreting sound. So when all of these sounds were mixing and blending, I think it created overwhelm, and it was hard to make sense of it or order it. And so he talks about the idea that sound, like people ultimately turned to visual forms to help create more order and make sense of things. So he talks about that, and his work is sort of characterized as acoustomology. He's looking at history through the lens of sound. So I'll just read his statement or his explanation. He's tracking sound waves. That's the acoustomology. He's the paths, trajectories, transformations, mediations, practices, and techniques that people employ to interpret and express their attitudes and beliefs about sound. So I borrowed that framework, and I decided to focus specifically to limit my sonic evaluation to the experience of Native Americans, English and European colonists, and Africans brought to America through chattel slavery, but then later who were living there, and some were freed, and so, but Africans / blacks in America. All right. the sonic characteristics and patterns that I was looking for along the way, I've listed a few things here that I was searching for. I wanted to understand vernacular singing, the distinctive singing and vocalization practices of people from their respective environments and cultures of origin before that was exposed, before that interacted with another culture. And also persistent or stable elements that remained after exposure. And so an example of that would be for many Native American tribes, cries and screams and yodeling are part of their vocalization and singing practices. Africans, by example, pair dance and movement with singing. It's just part of their practice. So those are vernacular examples. I was looking for sonic negotiation, evidence of ways that vernacular sounds were interacting and the people who were making them. So sometimes those were peaceful and collaborative, other times they were aggressive and violent, and frankly, sound was weaponized, and that's something, sonic warfare is something I talk about in the paper. I was looking for examples of melding. Melding, that's a word that I picked to describe sort of the blending of divergent vernacular traditions that was creating new things. This was aided or helped when there was something similar from one culture to another. So that's called mutual reinforcement by Garst. I borrowed his term, but as an example, the African call and response tradition was a mutually reinforced by the lining out, the method of teaching English psalm singing, when the leader would sing a phrase and then the people would repeat it back. It was an oral tradition. So melding and mutual reinforcement. Then I was also looking at syncretism, which is kind of a more specific word for melding. It's borrowed from linguistics, and it reflects that there's kind of an equality or balance between the elements that are part of the melding. So not one over the other, but they're held sort of in equal influence. And in this project, I identified American musical idioms as hybrid forms that resulted from the interaction of these divergent vernacular traditions through syncretism. Pardon me. All right. Cultural upgrading was an idea that came from Richard Stanislaw, and I was looking to understand responses to those American idioms, and cultural upgrading comes up when people see the thing that has mixed, it's no longer their pure form, and they think, oh, something's not good about it, and they hear something else. And cultural upgrading, they treat it with disdain, or they feel negative and judgmental about it. And then sacralization is an idea that I borrowed or used from the work of Levine in Highbrow, Lowbrow, a book that I read. And it's really connected with the idea of establishing artistic hierarchies, where one thing is sort of identified, one aesthetic, as sort of so pure that it's like holy or sacred, and then everything below it is devalued to maintain its primacy. And so that sometimes includes delegitimizing styles and the people who are singing them, demonizing them, creating that, like, just very, very intense force. And so I was looking for those patterns. All right, lighter subject for just a moment. I'm going to skip to explain how I did the bibliography before I share some findings. So I originally planned to choose 50 tune books for review, but I had access to like nearly 300 of them by the time that I was all done searching for them. I had found facsimile copies, PDFs online, some I saw in person, but I just made the decision to catalog all of these books. So I created a spreadsheet with all of the details that I found so that I would have it for future study and research. I focused on the front matter and the back matter, not the tunes like in a book, but just the explanations in the beginning and the end. I included things like the number of pages, salient quotations, the compiler and the publisher, special features. I included details about the music notation, like if they were called brevs or minims, later they get called quarter notes, and just to track changes that way. Round note heads versus shape note heads, because that comes up in Tunebooks, the creation of shape note singing and books. And so I did that. Then from that 300, I selected 25 to sort of include in the appendix here. And with that, I decided to include some images. I did biographical research about the composers or the compilers who put the books together. I tracked down citations and unknown references from all of these things just because I wanted to know, and I thought it might be helpful or beneficial since I was already in pretty deep. And then I included my notes and my commentary. So the way, this is just a picture, a screenshot of my spreadsheet, but the way that I chose the Tunebooks that I included in the appendix was like I was looking at them from a voice pedagogy perspective. So I was just looking sort of for the most singing instruction content that I could find. Some had very little. This lovely book doesn't have as much as some of the others, so it's not in my list. But I chose based on that. I was looking for patterns, for representative content, for novelty, things that surprised me, for historic connections, and then I also wanted to show a progression over time. I did look for language or words that I had found in the sonic evaluation. For example, the word hideous was often associated with the singing of Native Americans and people singing in that style. And so without referring to Native Americans, the language of hideous sort of is talking about Native Americans, and I was able to find that a reference, that language in one of the Tunebooks, so that those kinds of things are what I was looking for. All right. The findings are sort of overwhelming, but I'm going to try to just share a few brief things, patterns, things that I saw in the doing of this work. So in the sonic evaluation, I noticed that syncretism, the blending of cultures or traditions, vernacular traditions, increased with shared rituals like worship. So there was so much effort for Christian evangelism by English and Europeans with Native Americans and enslaved Africans. And in those spaces where they were worshiping and singing together, that ritualized thing just created all kinds of new form. And so also I noticed that the idioms, as they were creating and expanding, that was happening primarily in the context of sharing orally, right? Sort of that call response thing. Most of the new things, the negotiation of sound to create new things, was happening in an oral, ORAL/AURAL tradition. Then I noticed that there was usually a backlash against that. When there was too much integration, too much coming together of things, there was a backlash and anger, and that's when the cultural upgrading, the sacralization, those things started to kick in. And immediately then the solution was singing reform. We have to get people to teach them how to sing. We have to basically, sight read. We're going to move away from these oral traditions. We're going to make them sight read, because this is me. I don't know if I wrote it in the paper, but when you write something, you can hold people to that standard. Sound is harder to regulate. So backlash, and then singing reforms happened, and then another pattern that I noticed was, of course, people would want to protect their own vernacular traditions, and so things went into hiding, they went into safe spaces, or they worked to preserve those things so that they would not be lost. So those were some findings from the sonic evaluation. In the Tunebook evaluation, I basically learned that the instructions fell into these 5 categories: how to learn to sing, what it should sound like, how to use and care for the voice, and then voice science and function makes an appearance. How to learn to sing, it talks about you have to have a master teacher to teach you. You can't learn on your own. That would be terrible. That's something that comes up a lot. But then also cool, like instructions for making a metronome and how long to cut the string. Like, it's just really fascinating sort of combination of things, how to learn to sing. What to sing, again, I mentioned the repertoire concern, but the language of like really language evaluation, like most approved songs that are in here, and then other stuff gets labeled as trash. So really intentional sort of marketing of certain genres. Also, what it should sound like, so there's information about vowel shaping, diction instructions, desired vocal timbre for certain voice types, which voices should sing the melody in an ensemble, and other blending strategies for ensembles, articulation, ornamentation, how to stand, like just so many details about what it should sound like. Details, care of the voice, voice function. I found crazily a huge image of a larynx in one of the books from like the middle of the 1800s, and I was like, what? But there it was. So those were some of the things that I noticed, and a few other notable findings in the bibliographic study. I think that there is a really strong Italian bel canto. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that probably Tozzi's Florid Song, that treatise, would have been circulating either in the original Italian or a translation that would have come from England around the time of regular singing, which was like around the time when the first tune books, within the first 40 years of tune book publishing, which is crazy, but also fascinating. Another thing that I noticed was singing masters, the people who were publishing these books and teaching in singing schools, were just incredibly entrepreneurial, which doesn't surprise me because most of the voice teachers I know today are also sort of entrepreneurial in spirit. They would cobble together resources from all over the place, a little bit from here, a little bit from here. Some ingenious ideas and a real awareness of pedagogical need, and that just, it shows up like, oh, I'm doing this so that the student can learn this, so they can hear it, so whatever, just real thought to how people were learning, and that's pretty interesting. One other thing that I noticed is that there were sort of regional characteristics that emerged in different parts of the country as the singing and the singing instruction sort of moved around. And because it's the 150th anniversary of Shenandoah, I wanted to share this connection. I decided to include this as the last book in my in the appendix because J.H. Rubush was one of its authors. So this Messenger of Songbook, I just want to very quickly talk us through the sort of the lineage of that and understand that this is sort of a regional, there are regional characteristics here. So regular singing existed in New England. That's where it started. Tunesmiths like William Billings back in the 1760s, it's all in the paper, were doing their thing, and then people thought it wasn't sophisticated enough, and so it got pushed south and west. It didn't disappear, it just went somewhere else. And so it eventually ended up on the frontier and places like the Shenandoah Valley. It came here, singing instruction from that regular singing tradition. It came with Joseph Funk from Pennsylvania. He was a prominent compiler of shape note tune books, and he came to the Shenandoah Valley and he established Singer's Glen. And so Rubush is the great grandson of Funk. So we can just sort of trace it back to like William Billings and the Tunesmiths up there in New England, and I find that fascinating. So Rubush was a professor at Shenandoah and helped establish the school, I think, and this, I find it fascinating. This tune book, if you can see it, it's hard to see it, discusses voice function. How cool is that? That at Shenandoah we were discussing voice function, but of course we were, because we're still discussing it, and things come from somewhere. So I do find it ironic, however, that he identifies the diaphragm as the primary muscle for breath support. And of course, if you're a modern day voice pedagogue, we are often trying to explain to people, but that's part of it, but that's not the whole story. There's more to be known, and right, we're always working on this. But I just find it kind of ironic that I don't think he originated that idea, but he was instrumental in passing it along to a whole lot of people, because he taught a lot of teachers at Shenandoah, but then he also traveled with a lot of his friends and colleagues to teach at normal schools all over the Shenandoah Valley. So if somebody says I use my diaphragm when I sing, it should be no surprise to any of us that that language is still circulating, because this was monumental. So, okay. I'm nearly done. There are so many implications, I think, for future research for this, and I just sort of was thinking about them in categories. The idea, like, of, you know, functional singing at Shenandoah. There are there are patterns in regional singing and teaching styles that I think could be looked into further that would be fascinating. And that would include sort of the source and lineage of singing instructions and singing methodologies, just understanding where it all came from. American singing instructors, those singing masters are fascinating people, and I think just to understand a little bit more about them would help us understand more about how the profession developed. There are huge implications, I think, for music and church history research, and then also a lot that might be known and studied about performance practice. Let's see, and my hope is that others might be inspired to use these resources, and that was part of the reasoning for all of the detail in the bibliographic study. Implications for the voice community. This is just a reminder that the past is still operating in the present. And sort of the more we know about that, the better informed we can be. I would encourage that we need to interrogate our standard singing and voice pedagogy practices for lingering entanglements, because they're there and we just don't always understand, why we stand still in a choir. Right? Sound still matters. It has more power than we might realize. We can weaponize it against each other. We can be overwhelmed by it. We still use it to determine identity and belonging, and we still use it to judge others and their value. And that's not something we can avoid 100%, but we can begin to pay attention differently. And finally, I feel like we can claim our collective history, the good, the bad, the ugly, and choose how to use our power and influence in a responsible way. This is a shared heritage. It's our collective story. I'm kind of done talking, and I've just loved the process of completing this project. It's already impacted the way that I teach and sing and interact with other voice traditions that are different from my own. And I'm excited to keep doing this work and sharing this work. And keep at it. I just want to, I'm done talking. I want to acknowledge Dr. Ruth for being my advisor and being so helpful. I want to thank all of you for being on my committee. It's been really remarkable to do this and know that at some level I had the support of other people in it, and that makes a really huge difference. So I'm thankful for that. Thankful for my husband Tom, who is here. That's right, and there may be some folks, thank you, watching on the live stream that I have here, and so thank you all so much. And
all right, thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
So with the looming auditions, Byron, why don't you get us started with a few questions or comments for Polly?
And actually, the opera that we're auditioning for tonight is a 70-minute unaccompanied opera, and it's full of word fragments and slides and